Hi, everybody. Here is the promised lecture on natural law theory, or abbreviated NLT. So, what is natural law theory? So, natural law theory holds that moral principles are derived from human nature and reason. Principles are objective, they're universal and knowable through rational reflection on the nature and purpose of human beings. So notice here that I said objective. So this is taking us out of the idea of moral relativism. And so I think you're going to find that this expands on some of the ideas that we've talked about in class so far and gives you more information from which to base your own choices. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to define natural law theory and explain its key tenets. You should be able to identify its historical and philosophical foundations. You should be able to compare it with other moral theories like divine command theory, moral relativism, and later on we'll be talking about utilitarianism. So you may want to come back to this lecture once we've reached that point in the class. And you should also be able to evaluate some key criticisms of this theory and the modern relevance it has for our times. So some of the key claims that natural law theory has is that its morality is grounded in human nature and reason, not in divine command alone. But what does this mean? This means that there are moral laws that are inherent in the structure of our reality. And so that means that we are born with these laws already in existence within our very being. What is natural, then, is often seen as what is right, although this really needs some careful unpacking because it can get us into some very sticky situations. So its ancient roots come from Aristotle, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas. And so let's talk a little bit about those three philosophers. So from Aristotle, there's this idea of teleology, and that means that all things have a purpose, a telos. For humans, that purpose is rational human flourishing, according to Aristotle. And so we want to make sure that what we're doing is making us flourish in the best way possible, and that we are living in accordance with reason and virtue. And those virtues will lead us to a good life. In fact, Aristotle says we can't even really lead a good life unless we are virtuous. And so we should cultivate those virtues. Now, this also goes back to Plato. Plato believes in excellence and cultivating our own excellence through, practice. And one of these excellent points of things that we could develop within ourselves would be patience, right? I've noticed within myself that I've developed patience over the years just through having children. And so maybe I wasn't so great with patience 30 years ago, but over time I've cultivated patience, and this has turned into a great virtue for me. So Aristotle was all about virtue, ethics, and how to lead a good life through cultivating good virtues. So in the classical natural law, theory is Cicero. And Cicero believes that true law is right reason in agreement with nature. So universal moral laws are accessible to all humans regardless of culture. So now you see where the universal piece comes in. We're not just relying on cultural relativism, but these universal moral laws should apply to everybody, everywhere, regardless of who they are and what culture they belong to. And so there was a medieval synthesis of these ideas because Cicero and Aristotle come from before medieval times. So Thomas Aquinas, who was writing in 1225 to 1274, or at least that's when he was living, he combined Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy. So this is an interesting move, and The reason this is interesting, I'll tell you about 4 types of law in Aquinas' thought. So there's eternal law, which is God's reason or order. There's divine law that's revealed through the scriptures. There's natural law, which is discoverable by human reason. And then there's human law, or laws that we create in our own societies. But notice that in Aquinas' view, these are only valid if they align with natural law. So human laws should not be followed if they do not align with natural law. So Aquinas believed that God's eternal law is made knowable to humans through natural law. So let's think about maybe some of the core principles of natural law theory. And that is one of these ideas that moral knowledge can be known through reason. That means that all humans, no matter where they come from, can discern right from wrong by reflecting on human nature and purposes. So that's something that's not taking place externally to us. It's taking place within us. It's internal. Reasoning is something that we do in our minds when we're using critical thinking and problem-solving skills and not relying on things that are external or outside of us. And this is kind of a big key topic in philosophy that you may have, if you've taken an intro to philosophy course, come across before. So some of the basic goods would be life, reproduction, education, sociability, truth, worship or appreciation of higher goods, and practical reasonableness. So these are some of the applied topics that come up when we think through natural law theory. So Aquinas talks about this doctrine of double effect, that sometimes an action can have 2 effects, one that's intended and one that's unintended. And that's true if you think about something we'll discuss later in the class, which is consequentialism. Most of us will rely on weighing pros and cons before we make a choice. And sometimes there are unintended consequences that occur as through the choices that we make. We just simply can't think through all the possible reasons, but we'll be talking about that later in class. So let's get back to the doctrine of double effect. So things could be morally permissible if the act itself is good or neutral. The bad effect is not intended. The good effect isn't achieved via the bad, and there's proportionally a grave reason. So an example of this might be giving high-dose pain medication that may hasten death, but with the intention of relieving pain. So if you're interested in ideas on euthanasia, which we'll also talk about later in the class, this will be an example of that doctrine of double effect that you can refer back to. So there are some criticisms of natural law theory. David Hume is one of the philosophers that brought up some of these criticisms. And this is called the is-ought problem. You cannot logically derive an ought from an is. So just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's morally good. So you might want to write that down in your journal and explore that idea because it's quite profound. So what happens then with cultural and moral diversity? What if natural varies between cultures or time periods? Views on family, sexuality, and gender roles have changed over time, and we saw some of that in our discussions on moral relativism. Another problem is there's this ambiguity of nature. What exactly is human nature? Can it be precisely defined? How would we define it? And some critics of natural law theory use it to justify both progressive and repressive views on different issues that come up over time. So this is something that's happened throughout time. It's not just happening within our culture right now, because over time, our views on things like sexuality or war or gender have changed. And so we can use natural law theory either to justify or to not justify the same thing. So there are some secular and some theistic versions of natural law theory. The theistic version is that natural law is part of a divine order, and that is from Thomas Aquinas. The secular is a view about human flourishing that we talked about with Aristotle, and on shared human features, with Phineas talks about in his philosophical ideas. So this kind of a tension between religious and secular versions. So how does this all fit in then with contemporary issues? You will find that natural law theory has strongly influenced Western legal thought. The US Declaration of Independence says laws of nature and of nature's God, and you'll find lots of references to God throughout our history. Human rights frameworks also work with things like universal dignity and justice. So we'll see this throughout the justice that we find in our court system. And we'll be talking about some contemporary court cases and how they've applied natural law theory to the outcomes of the case. So some real world debates that we'll get into have to do with things like abortion, euthanasia, same-sex marriage, war and peace, and civil disobedience. So a reflection question for you to put in your journal might be, can natural law justify civil disobedience when human law is unjust? So there's this tension between, again, the idea of human law versus law that comes from nature. So in that way, it's similar to divine command theory, where we saw that there was this juxtaposition between human law and divine authority. So in that way, we can make that connection. So that's pretty much a wrap of our overview on natural law theory. Hopefully this helped to explain our chapter a little further and will help you dive into your homework assignments. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on natural law theory, and I hope you enjoyed this video.